The Comanche were a fierce and formidable force in North America, known for their relentless raids and devastating impact on the settlers of the American frontier. The Comanche people, often referred to as the Lords of the Plains, were skilled horsemen, hunters, and warriors who dominated much of the Southwest, including parts of Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Their strength lay in their unmatched knowledge of the land, their ability to ride swiftly across vast distances, and their unyielding ferocity in battle. But behind the mastery of warfare was also a deep-rooted culture of terror that they instilled through their raids, particularly against women and children. The Comanche raids were not haphazard or spontaneous. They were strategic, designed to break the spirit of their enemies, disrupt the flow of life, and send a clear message of dominance. The Comanche would often strike quickly and without warning, usually under the cover of darkness, attacking settlers who were unprepared and vulnerable. The raids were swift, brutal, and marked by utter violence. The goal was not just to kill, but to instill fear and subjugate the enemy. The Comanche warriors were trained from a young age, and their ability to fight on horseback gave them a unique edge. This mastery of horsemanship allowed them to approach and retreat from battle with speed and precision, overwhelming their targets before they even had time to defend themselves. With a highly organized and disciplined structure, they would often surround settlements, cutting off any potential escape routes, leaving their victims trapped. The brutality of these raids wasn't limited to men or soldiers. It was extended to women and children, particularly during the early years of European settlement. While many tribes practiced war, the Comanche's tactics against women, especially pregnant women, were particularly horrific. This violence was not merely an act of war. It was a psychological tool designed to terrorize entire communities. Pregnant women, in particular, became victims of unimaginable cruelty. The Comanche believed that by striking at the most vulnerable members of society, they would break the resolve of their enemies and send a message that no one was safe. During these raids, pregnant women were often targeted, and their suffering was a tool of terror. Women who had already suffered the brutal realities of frontier life were subjected to horrific acts during Comanche raids. It was common for pregnant women to be captured, with their fates sealed in the brutality that followed. They were often taken as prisoners of war, but the journey didn't end there. Their treatment was marked by physical and psychological cruelty. In some cases, pregnant women were slaughtered on the spot with no mercy shown. The purpose of these acts was to break the enemy's spirit, to create an atmosphere of fear where the settlers would know that no one, no matter how innocent or vulnerable, was exempt from the cruelty of the Comanche raids. In other instances, these women, communities they were a part of. These acts were meant to instill terror, to make people believe that the Comanche were unstoppable, and that there would be no protection from the violence that came with their raids. Additionally, captivity was often another form of suffering for pregnant women. After being captured, many women were forced to endure long, harrowing journeys as prisoners. They were marched through harsh conditions, sometimes being forced to carry their children or even give birth in captivity under appalling circumstances. While some women were eventually released, many were kept as slaves or forced to live under the control of the Comanche, suffering further abuse during their time in captivity. The acts of violence committed against pregnant women were not random. They were deeply embedded in the Comanche tactics of psychological warfare. By attacking the most vulnerable members of society, they sent a message that no one was safe. The fear of being targeted during a raid caused a ripple effect throughout the entire frontier. It was not just about the immediate victims, it was about breaking the will of entire communities. Pregnant women, often the symbol of new life and hope, became a central focus of these raids because their suffering represented the vulnerability of the future. Their brutal treatment left scars not just on the individuals who survived, but on the collective psyche of the communities they came from. The role of the Comanche chiefs and leaders was to direct these raids, ensuring they were executed with precision and efficiency. These raids were meticulously planned, and they were as much about strategy and control as they were about the violence itself. By targeting women and children, particularly those who were pregnant, they ensured that the psychological impact of their actions would extend far beyond the physical death toll. They used the suffering of pregnant women as a tool to erode the will to fight, to instill fear in their enemies, and ensure compliance through terror. The brutal treatment of pregnant women during Comanche raids wasn't just a matter of violence. It was a calculated form of terror designed to devastate not only the immediate victims, but the entire community. These acts were often sadistic, leaving emotional and psychological scars that lasted long after the immediate violence was over. The Comanche knew that in order to break the will of their enemies, they had to strike at the very heart of their civilization, their families, and more specifically, their women and children. Pregnant women, who were already physically vulnerable, became symbols of weakness in the eyes of the Comanche warriors. They understood the immense emotional value these women held for their families, and by targeting them, the raiders aimed to inflict maximum devastation. The Comanche attacks were meant to send a message that no one, not even a pregnant woman, was safe. The horror didn't just come from the violence itself, but from the psychological toll it took on the communities. One of the most horrific acts committed against pregnant women during the raids was forced disembowelment. Captives, often pregnant, would be mutilated, with the unborn children ripped from their wombs in brutal fashion. This barbaric act was carried out not just for its physical horror, but as a symbolic gesture of domination. The attackers knew that this would leave lasting trauma on the women and their families, effectively killing any hope of recovery. The idea was not just to kill, but to break the spirit of the victims and their loved ones. The pregnant women who survived such attacks often carried the emotional scars for the rest of their lives. But these unspeakable acts went beyond physical harm. The psychological toll of witnessing such atrocities often left survivors utterly broken. The fear of such events haunted entire communities. In some instances, the women who survived these brutal raids would be forced into slavery, enduring constant abuse as they were captured and relocated. Even if they were not killed, they were often subjected to further degradation, treated as property, stripped of their identity, and forced to live under the cruel rule of their captors. Pregnant women who were taken captive faced even more inhumane treatment. They were often marched through rough terrain and harsh conditions, enduring the most grueling conditions imaginable. If they gave birth in captivity, it was often under dire circumstances with no medical attention and minimal care. These women were forced to endure the pain of childbirth in environments filled with filth, disease, and the constant threat of death. The mental toll was unfathomable, as these women found themselves isolated, often separated from their families, and subjected to further torment as prisoners of war. The emotional suffering of these women is nearly impossible to comprehend. Imagine the despair of a woman who, already vulnerable due to pregnancy, is ripped from her home, subjected to cruelty, and forced to witness the destruction of her family. These acts left more than physical scars. They destroyed the very spirit of the communities they targeted. The fear and loss that permeated these raids carried on for generations, as families were torn apart and the communities left to rebuild from the emotional devastation. As part of their raids, the Comanche didn't just kill, they stripped people of their dignity and sense of safety. They terrorized women in particular because they understood that to target a pregnant woman was to target the future itself. It wasn't just about killing one individual. It was about making a statement to the entire community that the future was under siege. Killing pregnant women sent a message of despair, for it symbolized the end of life in the most painful and graphic way. The physical trauma was just the beginning. The psychological trauma of these events was so overwhelming that many of the survivors, who were lucky enough to escape, did not live without long-term damage. Even those who were fortunate enough to be released or to escape these raids often struggled to find peace after experiencing such unspeakable violence. The emotional scars were deep and could not be erased by the passage of time. Many survivors lived the rest of their lives haunted by the memories of what they had witnessed and endured. For the Comanche, their brutality was part of their strategy. They knew that terror and fear were just as powerful as weapons. The mental and emotional breakdown of their enemies was one of the most effective tactics they employed. And by making pregnant women the central focus of their brutality, they ensured that the psychological cost of their raids would be immense and long-lasting. In many ways, the Comanche raids were about more than just military strategy. They were about using violence as a tool of psychological control. Women, particularly pregnant women, represented the future of the settlers and their families. By targeting these women, the Comanche made it clear that there was no safety, no sanctuary from their terror. The terror of the raids didn't end with the attacks themselves. It continued long after, as the emotional and psychological wounds carried on, deepening the fear and despair that plagued the survivors. The Comanche's use of psychological warfare through the targeting of pregnant women in their raids left a scar on history. It was a cruel and merciless tactic that not only shattered the lives of the women and their families, but also left an indelible mark on the communities they attacked. The terror they spread was not just in their actions, but in the psychological trauma that echoed across generations.